If you sense that racial tension in our country has only gotten worse in recent years, that's not your imagination. From Black Lives Matter to critical race theory, we've seen a number of attempts to create disunity in our country. But what does it look like for followers of Jesus to engage in racial reconciliation, to strive for a healthy unity among God's image bearers, and specifically to overcome the curse of identity politics? Welcome to the Truth Changes Everything podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Jeff Myers, and during this show, we're going to explore where God is at work changing everything through Jesus, who is the incarnation of the truth. Today, we're going to be talking about how the truth changes the way we think about and experience race, unity, and reconciliation. There's going to be a huge practical suggestion in the middle of this. I don't want to spoil it. But it's amazing. It's a breakthrough. My guest today is Dr. George Yancey. He's a professor of sociology with an academic interest in race relations and the anti-Christian attitudes that are being expressed in the United States. Concerning racial issues, he's developed a Christian model for race relations that goes beyond colorblindness, goes beyond anti-racism, and he covers this model in a book called Beyond Racial Division. Now, this is one thing I love about George. He relies on scholarly work and a logical appeal to help us find a better way forward, something that's transcendent, that it's transformational, it's a metamorphosis. And I think it's going to give us a better vision, not only for race relations, but also to help us understand how to move forward in the face of political polarization. So please welcome Dr. Yancey to the Truth Changes Everything podcast. Dr. George Yancey, welcome to the show today. Really glad to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
I've been looking forward to this conversation for a while. We spoke together at an event last year, almost a year ago, in Washington, D.C., and you've spoken out at a Summit Ministries adult conference before. I've really especially admired your work in sociology, but very resourceful. The way you do research and the way you arrive at conclusions doesn't always line up with the way most research is done or people expect it to. It's innovative, and there are a lot of breakthroughs here. So I really wanted to dig into that related to issues of racial reconciliation today.
Sure. And, I'll clarify a little bit. My research methodology is not that innovative. I do what other sociologists do. My research questions. I ask different questions that other people do.
Yes.
And so I could come to some different conclusions. So, I'm not doing any sort of wild thing that no other sociologist is doing. I mean, I do basic stats and qualitative assessments and nothing, and it's pretty boring stuff for the typical sociologist. But I do think my questions are different.
I think so too. Thank you for clarifying that. I really appreciate your putting it that way. It's always fun to listen to you on all these topics, but here's the question that I really was trying to grapple with today. Gallup and other organizations doing polling continue to ask questions about racial attitudes. And one of the questions they've asked consistently through time is, do you think race relations are getting better or worse? And one thing we're seeing right now is that race relations don't seem to be getting better. And this is obviously going to be a factor in the upcoming elections. But there are a lot of other things, just what it means to be an American and to live together in community. What do you think is happening there as a sociologist?
So I kind of like to take us focus off a little bit off the forthcoming election. I know, it's going to be in 3 months and it's on a lot of people's minds, and I'm not saying that that's not important at all. But I think to understand your question, I think we can't just look at what's coming, what's here. And so to get this proper framework, that question has an interesting history. So probably till about 2012, you saw an uptick in people believing that race relations are getting better. And then 2012, and I am still trying to figure out what happened in 2012. Because a lot of things happened in 2012. One of the things that happened is, from that point on, you start seeing less and less people thinking that race relations are getting better. And when I say a lot of things happened, there's some research out there that shows that there was this dramatic uptick in the attention towards issues such as racism and sexism and Islamophobia in the media and in academia. It just sort of exploded, and so you had all this attention now paid to that. And you also saw, and I think this is related, you also saw a downturn in mental well-being. And I say this is related because I just did some research showing that adherence to identity politics and mental well-being are inversely related, which means that the more you're into identity politics, the less healthy you're going to be. And that's a correlation. So I'm not making a causal argument right here, but I'm just saying that's correlated. And so when you concentrate on all these racism and sexism and all these identity politics things, it makes sense that you have lower levels of mental well-being as well. So something happened, and once again, I'm giving all these. This is like a great detective story where I don't know who did it. Something happened in that point in time. So from that point in time on, so this is not just something that just happened this year. From 2012 till today, you've seen this downtick in people believing that race relations are getting better, and I don't know if it's continued, whether it's plateaued, but that is the dramatic thing that's happened. And now you can see, we're more at odds with each other in a way we weren't, say, 10 years ago or 12 years ago. So that is sort of the bigger picture of what's happening with race relations and other issues as well.
As a follow-up to that, I wonder, I'm interested to hear that race relations have been declining since 2012. I would have thought that maybe with the Black Lives Matter and the riots in 2020, that might have been the point of reversal. But what you're saying is, no, this has been some time in coming.
Yeah. Now, you bring up a really good, interesting point. So, what I think happened is 2020 happened because of whatever happened in 2012.
Okay.
So think about it this way: 2012, you get all this attention towards racial issues, all right, as well as other issues. We get all this attention towards racial issues. But you don't have this sort of lashing out. You don't have the protest. But attitudes begin to change. So that when 2020 happens, now you have an atmosphere that's conducive toward the sort of protests and even sometimes riots that would take place. I mean, you in Colorado definitely know. Some of the worst of it was happening in Colorado because that's what happened. That's where I'm sorry.
It's Minnesota. Yeah. Denver was quite bad. Yeah.
Denver, I'm sorry, I got my states mixed up. Both cold states up north. But anyways, so 2020, it's where people noticed it, but it was happening since 2012. The attitudes are changing to prime people to be able to engage in that sort of protest and such.
One thing I've heard a couple of different scholars talk about tribalism more, and I want to dig into that a little bit because we have had this idea, and how well we've lived up to it is debatable, that the United States is a great melting pot, that people come from all over the world, and then together we are primarily Americans. We have different heritages, but our primary identity is as Americans. But obviously, and you've been in academics your whole life, and so that was my field for many years until I came to be full-time at Summit Ministries. But I've seen this, that identity politics has become a kind of tribalism where people, they don't just say, well, this is who I think I am. It's, no, this is my tribe and this tribe is right. And all of a sudden you have this breakdown of what we thought made America unique.
So I do believe identity politics is a big key to this. And I'm getting more and more interested in understanding identity politics and the role it's playing in. And some of my research is heading in that direction. So here's the way to think about it. Identity politics is basing your politics among, there's using identity as a source for your political activism. That's the way I think about identity politics, all right? And in a way, it's sort of on the left, it would replace Marxism in many ways. Because Marxism is an ideology of it's about saving society as a whole. And if there is an identity, it's between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. And just to define that for people who are not aware of that, the bourgeoisie is the people who own the means of production. They own the factory stuff. The proletariat is the workers. That's a quick and dirty way. A true Marxist says I'm being too simplistic, and that's fine. But that's a way of looking at it. And there may have been some of that, but other than that, it's about, we the people as a group. It's not really based in identity per se. But then there's a movement towards identity politics, which, is our identities are basis for activism. So we must do whatever we can to help this group. And for the left, this group became people who are racial minorities, sexual minorities, sometimes the poor, although I think less than they want to admit it. These sort of groups, ethnic groups, that sort of things. Now, here's a danger. This is also happening on the right. I think the left led out with identity politics. Clearly, that I mean, I don't think there's no real debate that that's happened. But what's also beginning to happen is you're seeing this on the right, and now the identity is around whites and Christians. And while the well-being is worse on the left because they've been engaged in this longer, I believe they've been engaged in this longer, you're beginning to see it start catching up on the right. That the right is starting to have lower levels of well-being in ways that they hadn't before as well. So this identity politics, where you focus in on your group and you focus in on what's good for your group and you build your politics on that and you have to win. Losing is not acceptable in identity politics. And what's scary about that is I've done some reading on terrorist groups. And one of the things that motivate terrorist groups is losing is not acceptable. And I'm not saying that all the groups doing identity politics are terrorists. I'm just saying that we're laying a framework that's been on the left, but now it's come to the right. And I think people on the right have to recognize this, that we can do some things that maybe 10 or 12 years ago, we think there's no way I would do that. And now that's coming to forefront. And so this feeds into this sort of deep polarization, this deep tribalism, which I fear, regardless of who wins in November, it's just going to get worse.
Yeah, I'm afraid you're right. I see a lot of this as well. I see a willingness to speak violently, if not to act violently. I'm watching, of course. My most recent book was on should Christians support Israel, because that's what I was observing in the streets, and even just when I was. I'm not sure when this episode's going to be released, but I was just last week in Washington, D.C. The Prime Minister from Israel was there speaking. The protesters were there, and spray painting on the Columbus Memorial, Hamas is coming. They know why they're writing that on there. They know why they carved a hammer and sickle into the replica of the Liberty Bell. They know why they wrote Intifada Revolution on the Liberty Bell. I mean, there's not any question about what's going on there. They have come to believe that they know who the oppressors are, and any action against the oppressors is done in self-defense and is legitimate. Is that the kind of thing, when you say identity politics sort of makes people move in that direction? Is that the kind of thing you're talking about? I mean, is that actually where we seem to be going with the way we look at political issues?
Yeah, it's that us and them mentality, so that we are always right and they are always wrong. And so we cannot lose to them. And it leads to sort of a dehumanization of the other. And social scientists we've studied a lot about dehumanization of the other. Unfortunately, sometimes we don't recognize that some of the groups that we support, I say we as a group, not necessarily myself, but we as a group, can engage in that, and then we sort of excuse that because we've fallen into them and us. And the way you phrased it is the way a religious terrorist would phrase it. And there's a book out there. It's been out for about 25 years. It's a great book, Terror in the Mind of God. And he talks about, George Meyer is the author, and he talks about how, you satanize the opponent, and then anything you do to them is allowable. And I'm hearing that rhetoric on the left and the right, that we have to win no matter what. And whatever we do, if we have to lie well, they lie too, so it's acceptable for us to lie. And with the cheat, if we have to threaten, well, they're threatening too, so it's okay for us to threaten. That's a very scary world that we're creating for this. Which is why, as I've gotten older, I've become more and more disenchanted with identity politics. And as an African American and someone who studied institutional racism, I understand that those are important issues that need to be dealt with, and I want them dealt with. But I can't go down this identity politics route of dealing with them because I know where it goes. And so we got to deal with them as a group and not just as, well, this group is always right and we got to do whatever we can to defend this group, no matter what. And that's frightening to me.
Yeah. I'm disturbed as I I'm thinking this through because I see what you're saying. I see that people. I even heard somebody, a conservative, say, "Well, we should, if they're going to use Saul Alinsky's rules for radicals, then we should take it and we should use it against them." And I realized that they're not viewing this as an issue of clear moral standards up against a chaotic worldview. They're viewing this as a brawl. It's a street brawl. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so we're going to use whatever techniques or tactics we need to use, which means that the idea that we are all together, it's we the people, of the people, by the people, for the people, that it is, we have to figure out how to unify ourselves together. That now it seems like both sides have given up on that idea entirely, that what we want is the clash, which goes back to what you mentioned about Marxism. The clash is at the heart of it. That was the core to the Marxist worldview. We don't want unity. We want the clash because that's how history is going to advance.
Well, Marxism, you're right to a certain extent. That there is the bourgeoisie who have to be overthrown. But once you overthrow the bourgeoisie, the idea behind Marxism, I'm not saying I agree with 100%, but I'm just saying this is what the idea behind Marx is. Once you overthrow the bourgeoisie, then we all are going to be working together in this great community together. And so this is why Marxism really wasn't into identity politics per se. It was, how we all are going to work together to create a better society. And that was the ideal behind Marxism. But of course, it did have the enemy that you had to overthrow. And one of the critiques of Marxism one could argue is that once you overthrew that enemy, would you not create a new enemy?
Right.
And of course, I think that's a fair critique of Marxism. But just to be honest, it's not an identity politics in that we Marxists, we're here for the African American or for the transgender or for the women or anything like that. No, we're here for everybody.
Mm-hmm. So when you look at things like, when I was in college on our debate team, we had a topic on education I think it was an education topic. So we read all of the critical theorists coming out of Harvard, and it was feminist theory at that point in time. Yeah. But do you think that was that the beginning of identity politics, that kind of thing? Because that seemed, when I was reading it at the time, it seemed very related to a Marxist worldview.
Yeah. I'm not sure that was that. Some of the reasons on identity politics, one of the arguments is that, the idea of Marxism was that we're going to create this beautiful system. And the hope was that we're going to start seeing this in the Soviet Union, what was called the Soviet Union at the time. Before it even fell apart, people knew that the Soviet Union was this tremendous abusers of human rights.
Yeah.
Even people on the left knew this. I mean, they were trying to make reasons why it was. They were under pressure from capitalism and they had a capitalist world system and they had to operate in that. But we knew that. But over time, people became disenchanted with that. And they said, is this what Marxism is? And so I think part of the disenchantment with Marxism, that it's not going to get there, it's not going to achieve our political goals, is what led eventually to saying, all right, how can we achieve our political goals? Well, we can use these identities of these marginalized groups and advocate for them and achieve our political goals. And just to give you an example of that, and this is something that I always thought was, even before I deeply looked into this, I always thought this seemed weird. Native Americans. And some people would talk about how Native Americans, and sort of the noble Native American. And this is what I was hearing in grad school and this sort of stuff. And these Native Americans looked exactly like, value-wise, not in culture, but value-wise, they looked exactly like the sort of white progressive values. They were environmentalists. If you listen to white people, they were egalitarians. They were feminists. They were very tolerant of LGBTQ people. And I just came to the conclusion, you know what? If Native Americans are who they are, there's no way that they're fitting into this mold that we were creating for them. Mm-hmm. And so I didn't fully think about it at the time, but now looking back, I realized what was happening was people were taking an avocation for Native Americans and reading into them the values that they wanted. And then for fight for Native Americans, they're fighting for their own values.
Got it.
And that's what identity politics emerged out of.
Okay.
This desire to create, I really haven't been able to really do the research to back this up, but I really believe that a lot of the fighting for different identity groups, and I'm not saying that they don't care about these groups, but I think that beyond it is a sort of a projection of secular progressive values onto these groups. And thus, in fighting for these groups, you're fighting for your own secular progressive values.
Yeah.
And if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that makes perfect
you read
sense.
Third time, you would
I don't usually,
see
I don't usually stop in the middle and start taking notes, but I am right now. So yeah, that makes perfect sense. So that also helps us understand things like why people might say they stand up for Hamas. They know it's an apocalyptic rape and death cult. Right. But they say they project onto them the values that they want to believe, and then make them the noble.
Yeah, the Hamas thing, that's one of the hardest ones for me because, just trying to put myself in the mind of a secular progressive. It's hard to argue that what Hamas wants is women's rights. It's really hard to make that argument. I almost wonder whether or not it's the hostility towards, for whatever reason, Israel and Jews.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's a hard one. I think it's, I think you can more. I think the argument is a little bit dishonest, but you can more easily make the argument for, say, Native Americans because no one knows much about them.
Right.
And you can make the argument maybe for African Americans as well to some degree. But the Hamas thing, that's one that if I ever get around to studying would be very fascinating how people rectify supporting Hamas, knowing that they are not, that they're not LGBTQ friendly or they're not pro women and they're not, the things that normally we associate with these sort of progressive values.
I had a conversation yesterday. I do a Q&A on Israel with the students because I want them to feel free to ask all of their toughest questions. Yeah. And one student asked, can you explain why people in the LGBTQ community would have a group called Gays for Gaza? Why would they have that? Why would they think that this is, they know Hamas. They know that if actual gay people went to Gaza and said, Hamas, we're here to help, that they wouldn't live through it. We know this about that group. And so I said, well, there's this old saying, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Mm-hmm. I said, who do you think the individuals in the LGBTQ group think is their ultimate enemy, who they think Hamas also has as its ultimate enemy? And that led to a pretty interesting conversation for the next 30 minutes with the group. Yeah. Because they realized, there's something more going on here. There's something that they believe will be better off, that will get torn down, that they want torn down, if they somehow are in league with these people.
It's funny you say that because I actually have a paper coming out later on this year. It's called, and the title is The Enemy of My Enemy. And it doesn't deal with Hamas, it deals with African Americans. And so in the paper, what I show is that sentiment towards fundamentalists is highly predictive of attitudes towards African Americans, even after controlling for all other things, political identity and all this other stuff. So that, and so what I'm arguing is that, some of the support that African Americans receive is because they're perceived of politically as being progressive, and therefore progressives support them because what they're really are afraid of. Because what I look at is, a threat. Are you feeling threatened? And that's the question I use. And so I look at, are you feeling threatened? So they perceive a threat from was the fundamentalists? I think it's fundamentalists. Perceive a threat from fundamentalists, and therefore they support African Americans because they're the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So that's kind of funny you use that, because that's the direction I've gone with some of my research. Is I'm trying to look at, if you look at the research, a lot of it focuses on the fears of whites and of conservatives. Why this is where a lot of Christian nationalism stuff comes from, because people are afraid and stuff like that. And I'm not denying that that's a factor. I'm not denying that's a factor. In fact, it is a factor. But what there's hardly any research on is the fears of progressives.
Wow.
And why that is so significant is that, when I did my research on anti-Christian bias, and you were at DC, so you know this. People with this bias tend to be white, male, highly educated, wealthy. In other words, they're powerful people. And so these are the people who are fearful of Christian fundamentalists or Christians, conservative Christians. And their fears are going to manifest itself in very powerful ways. And so the lack of any research on this, any really substantial research on this, all this focusing on white conservatives, which I'm not opposed to focusing on that research on that. I'm not opposed to doing research on it. I'm opposed to the over focus on it.
Yeah.
These people are very powerful, and they have fears, and they operate on those fears, and we should know what that's going to be like. And yet in academia, there's hardly any research on that. And that's why I'm trying to do some research on it as best as I can.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I think you're asking all the right questions. I wanted to, because we've kind of laid a foundation here for, 20 or so minutes about identity politics and how it relates to all these different things. But I think it's a strong enough foundation to begin talking specifically about something that you said in one of your books, Beyond Racial Division. And the subtitle, for those who are watching or listening who haven't heard of it, a unifying alternative to color blindness and anti-racism. And so you offer a vision of race relations that focuses on bringing unity rather than polarization. And I wonder if you would talk a little bit about, if you'd unpack that for us, the research that led to it, and what the recommendations are that you think could help us get a foothold and move forward.
Sure. So, when we look at research on diversity programs, things of this nature, by and large, diversity programs don't work. But when they do work, they work because they've taught people how to take the perspective of others. They've given people skills that they can use. This is when programs can work. A lot of the folks in the programs, just having Tim Wise up there lecturing whites on how racist they are, that doesn't work. But if we had people teach people how do we understand the perspective of other people, and to find solutions working together rather than trying to one-up each other, rather than have this sort of zero-sum game where where one group has to win and one group has to lose. Instead, can we find win-win solutions? That has potential, and the research shows this has potential to learn how to persuade people in a healthy way. Most Christians know that the way we do evangelism is not that we go and tell people how horrible they are and that they've got to come to Christ. That what they believe is utterly awful. Even if you believe that, you don't tell people that because that's not going to work. How you evangelize? You build friendships. You build rapport. You find areas of agreement. You admit when the other person has a good point. You admit when you're wrong. And so we should be doing that same thing on racial issues. And we Christians should be leading the way. In a problem with identity politics, we shouldn't be I'm not saying we shouldn't protect ourselves, but we shouldn't be using identity politics as Christians as our lead-in. We should be building rapport, trying to find ways of, areas of agreement, working together, showing people how we can do this in a world where we're so racially polarized. That's the vision that we should be aiming towards. And none of us have all the answers yet, but we need to be heading towards finding more and more of those answers if we want to be different, to have a more powerful witness in a post-Christian society and what we need to do.
What you're saying is fascinating because I hear, of course, it was a huge movement for 3 or so years to establish DEI programs in every school and every corporation. And as a lot of people just assumed, well, we believe this is the morally righteous thing to do, so we don't need to study it. We're just going to fund it. We're just going to do it. But you're actually looking at which ones of those programs work, saying that most of them don't.
I didn't do that research. I read the research on it.
You read the research, okay. And what has worked and what hasn't worked, most of them don't work, but the ones who do work are the ones who teach perspective taking. Mm-hmm. Can you give us an example of what that looks like? What does perspective taking? What is it? Say in a church, what would that look like?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so here's the way to think about it. All right, when I do my research, when I do qualitative work, I have to learn the perspective of other people, and so I engage in what's called active listening. So when I did research on atheists, I interviewed about 25 atheists. I asked them questions, and then I listened, and then to make sure I was clarified, I came back and said, okay, here's what I hear you saying. And then I would give it in my own words, and then they either say, yeah, you're right, or no, here's what you got wrong. Either way, I'm getting more perspective on what they're saying, thinking about. So perspective taking is a lot like that. That's the way that I've engaged in it, and other people have other techniques, which are, I've read other techniques which can be very useful, and I'm not saying that this is the best technique, and if you don't do this, you don't know what you're talking about. But I'm saying that that's what I've used in order to gain perspective, is to ask people questions, open-ended questions, clarifying questions, and then ask, and then try to put in your own words what their perspective is. And when I do that, then I know what they believe. I don't have to believe what they believe. I didn't become an atheist, but I learned why atheists believe what they believe. And we need to engage in that sort of perspective taken so that when we engage in conversations with each other, I don't assume I know your motivation. I've learned about your motivation from your perspective taking. And what disheartens me is when people come in and they say, these people believe this, and they phrase it in a way that those people would never phrase it. Mm-hmm. So, when I hear someone say, well, these Christians, they want to hire Trump because they want, whites to have power in society. And I know that that's not how people, I know if I asked, the vast majority of Christians why they vote for Trump, that's not the answer they're going to give. If I asked, is that what you want? They would say, no, that's not what I want. Now, you can say, well, they're trying to make themselves look good, and that's fine and all good, but that's not their perspective. And I approach them with that perspective, I'm never going to convince them of anything. Or what Christians may do on the left. When they say, well, the reason why they want to put DEI is that, that they want whites to be held down, and they don't care about whites. They want whites to be treated as second-class citizens. And if you ask people why they want DEI, that's not why they want DEI. And so we can argue and we can assume the worst of each other, or we can learn what each other actually believe and then work from there. And I believe the second way is the way that, I think that's what God would have us to do. And I think it's and better yet, I think academically it's shown that's the more effective way of doing things.
Yeah. I remember years ago reading a business book, and one of the core points of it was understand before being understood. Mm-hmm. What you're talking about sounds like that we ultimately, there aren't a lot of areas in life where we truly have scarcity. We can start a business and be successful, or whatever it happens to be. A vote is a truly scarce decision. You have to pick one of the candidates who's on the ballot. And so you might ultimately come down on one side or another, but what you're saying is you can, it's okay. You don't have to be defensive about it. You can ask people, why do you really think what you think? How do you feel about this? Tell me why. Am I phrasing this correctly? Am I understanding it? That we lose nothing from having that conversation.
Right, yeah. Well, and we were talking about identity politics, and part of the identity politics is you can't lose. And so when if I vote for one person and I work on another person, my goal is not to understand them. My goal is to convert them to voting for my person, because we cannot lose. But rather, what my goal is, okay, whether that person's converted or not, let me understand why they want to vote for Trump or Harris. And let me understand that. Now, maybe as I understand that, maybe I gain insight to say, hey, have you considered something else? And maybe they do eventually vote for the person I want. But if that's my initial goal, then I'm trying to beat down all their arguments before they even get it off the ground. And once I start doing that, then they become more defensive, and I have no chance of converting them. So I actually defeat my own goal by being so hostile towards them. But my goal is to understand them, and then maybe I'll learn something from them that maybe I may need to rethink things. But if my goal is to understanding, I might get that conversion anyways, but at best, I at least understand where they're coming from. And I give them a chance maybe to understand where I'm coming from. And we can work together on things that we can agree upon, that we can agree upon. And so I think identity politics has made it more difficult. And this is one of the reasons why I'm becoming more and more of an opponent of identity politics. More difficult to have these sort of collaborative conversations with each other. Because the goal is my person has to win no matter what.
Yeah. Well, this is a great foundation. I'd love to kind of, on the foundation, just build up a couple of stories here related to how this applies to racial reconciliation. What does a biblical worldview then, in addition to being a gracious person who asks others and invests in others personally, and I think it's really helpful to think about, if you want to persuade somebody, you would do it the way you would for evangelism. You want to be friendly. You want to take them into account. You don't want them to feel dehumanized. But what does a biblical worldview say about diversity and racial differences and discrimination, and what should Jesus followers do?
So there's two major biblical concepts I use when I think about how I deal with racial issues. And the first is human depravity. That we all suffer from human depravity, which means none of us have all the right answers. We all have a certain level of selfishness, a certain level of, I want for me and mine. And so when I enter a problem, I have to recognize that that's an issue there. And so I can learn from other people. It's not that I have all the answers and I just need to persuade everyone else of my answers. I can learn from other people. I need checks on my own depravity. So that's the first. And to me, from there, where I get to then is that we have to have conversations where we can learn from each other, not that we just shoot people down. And this is where I get to collab conversations. The second biblical principle I get is, we hold others in at least as much esteem, if not more, than we hold ourselves. That we care about others at least as much as we care about ourselves, if not more. And from that, so I look at issues, I have to think, okay, this person is an image bearer. What can I do that's the best for them as well as for myself? And I'm not saying that I don't take my needs into account at all. What I'm saying is that my motivation has to be for them as well as for me. And so for that reason, the notion of browbeating people down to find a solution is unbiblical. And I don't care whether it comes from the left or the right, it's unbiblical. We need to work together to find solutions together. And this this clearly gets back into the whole racial discussion that, we have this polarization. I talked about how since 2012, it's started getting worse. We don't know why, but it has. Okay, so it's gotten worse. We don't know why, maybe we'll figure it out. But the way we find ourselves back is to learn how to communicate with each other in ways that we build on each other's ideas rather than tear each other down. Because if we go that route, if we ignore the biblical mandate about human depravity and care about others, and my goal is to tear down your ideas, I'm not going to defeat you completely. You're going to still be around, and you're going to be there to try to tear down my ideas once you get power. And all it's about is who has the power. And so my goal now is not what's good for everyone, but can I keep the power? And it doesn't take much of imagination to see the horrors that come when the goals of a people in a group is power. And that is the number one goal. And unfortunately, I think that's what's happening in a lot of our politics today.
One of the themes of this show, George, is that truth changes everything. That when if you start with people, if you look back in history at people who believed that Jesus is the truth is not just a set of mathematical propositions or logical statements. It's a person. It's Jesus. Those people had an outsized impact on the world around them. And I wonder if you see that in terms of racial reconciliation. Have there been people who've been part of the body of Christ who've really helped or could help even in the future if we were to pay closer attention?
Yeah, I mean, I think, if you look at the work of John Perkins, an African-American activist who was beaten down and then went to community building. And his teachings is not it is not the sort of anti-racism teaching of Kendi. He challenges Christians to come live in community together. And he's challenged white Christians to come live community together, work beside, not above, but beside poor African Americans in the communities. You go look at the Quinea Farms. That's another great example. Now, having said that, I think unfortunately, too often times we Christians get drawn into the identity politics of the larger society, both on the left and the right. And so I think that, if we really want to make a difference and not just be doing what the rest of the world is doing, we're going to have to take radical steps in trying to communicate and build community with each other across the racial spectrum and the political spectrum. And in this sort of polarized society, that's going to be radical. But there are Christians who are doing it, but not enough.
Okay. Well, that's a really great call. We do tend to think in 2-year, 4-year cycles around how to gain political power. And we need to be thinking more deeply. And this is what we tell our students at Summit Ministries. Your vote's important. You've got to vote. You need to vote. You got to vote. You got to vote. But if you see the vote as the defining act of your citizenship, you're missing the point. It's the starting gun of the race. It's not the race. And the race is not about political power. The race is being clear about what the core principles are on which our country's based, and then developing the policies based on those, and then dealing with the personality differences that come up. So I think what you're doing is fantastic. I love your research. I love the way you ask these questions. For those who are watching and listening, George has also written on trying to understand from a research standpoint the difference between a progressive Christian worldview and an evangelical Christian worldview, and that there's more of a divide there, more of a difference than we realize. Maybe even, I think the way you phrased it was, it's really two different religions.
Yeah. That's what my co-author and I, we argue that we're sort of like seeing a split.
Yeah. Well, this is all real. This is fascinating research. So George, professor sociology, Baylor University, and thank you for what you're doing here. Thank you for the conversation and the practical way that you've approached this. I'm really grateful.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks for having me.
Thank you to my guest, Dr. George Yancey, for coming on the show today. You can learn more about his work at georgeyancey.com. And that last name, Yancey, is spelled Yancey. So georgeyancey.com. This podcast is a resource of Summit Ministries. At Summit, we exist to come alongside the rising generation, their trainers, parents, and influencers, so that the young people in our time may know God's truth and become champions of a biblical worldview. To learn more about Summit or to get more resources to help the young adults in your life embrace and share the truth that changes everything, visit summit.org. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.